Hey guys, here we are for Read Aloud again. Welcome back. Yesterday we read all of chapter 1 and we got to the end where Jacob's grandfather passed away, remember, out in the woods outside of his house. And then Jacob shined his flashlight and saw some type of creature that he thought was from the stories that his grandfather told him when he was younger. So in our next chapter, chapter 2, we're going to kind of learn about what happens next with Jacob and if people believe him, or like just kind of what his life is after his grandfather's death. Remember, I'm going to try to keep the video about 15 to 20 minutes. Last time we went over, because chapter 1 is pretty long. I'm going to tell you chapter 2 is pretty long also, so I'm thinking we might have to stop in the middle of it. But I'll set my timer for you like usual, and after it goes off, we'll kind of see where we are, okay? All right. Got the document camera right in front of me so I can read right on my lap here. So let's go ahead and get started. Here we are with chapter 2. Oh, let me set my timer. Okay. I spent the months following my grandfather's death, cycling through a purgatory of beige waiting rooms and anonymous offices, analyzed and interviewed, talked about just out of earshot, nodding when spoken to, repeating myself, the object of 1,000 pitying glances and knitted brows. My parents treated me like a breakable heirloom, afraid to fight or fret in front of me lest I shatter. Uh-oh. Sounds like he's been going to a lot of different, probably doctor's appointments, maybe going to see a therapist. I would imagine that someone is, he was pretty close to his grandpa, so I would imagine that this death, especially how he's the one who found him, probably didn't affect him very well. I was plagued by wake-up screaming nightmares so bad that I had to wear a mouthguard to keep from grinding my teeth into nubs as I slept. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing it, that tentacle-mouthed horror in the woods. I was convinced it had killed my grandfather and that it would soon return for me. Sometimes a sick, panicky feeling would flood over me like it did that night, and I'd be sure that nearby, lurking in the stand of dark trees, beyond the next car in the parking lot, behind the garage where I kept my bike, it was waiting. My solution was to stop leaving the house. For weeks, I refused even to venture into the driveway to collect the morning paper. I slept in a tangle of blankets on the laundry room floor, the only part of the house with no windows and also a door that locked from the inside. That's where I spent the day of my grandfather's funeral, sitting on the dryer with my laptop, trying to lose myself in online games. I blamed myself for what happened. If only I'd believed him, was my endless refrain. But I hadn't believed him, and neither had anyone else. And now I knew how he must have felt, because no one believed my version either. My version of events sounded perfectly rational until I was forced to say the words out loud. And then it sounded insane, particularly on the day I had to say them to the police officer who came to our house. I told him everything about that had happened, even about the creature, as he sat nodding across the kitchen table, writing nothing in his spiral notebook. When I finished, all he said was, "Great, thanks," and then turned to my parents and asked if I'd been to see anyone, as if I wouldn't know what that meant. I told him I had another statement to make, and then held up my middle finger and walked out. My parents yelled at me for the first time in weeks. It was kind of a relief, actually, that old sweet sound. I yelled some ugly things back, that they were glad Grandpa Portman was dead, that I was the only one who really loved him. The cop and my parents talked in the driveway for a while, and then the cop drove off, only to come back an hour later with a man who introduced himself as a sketch artist. He'd brought a big drawing pad and asked me to describe the creature again, and as I did, he sketched it, stopping occasionally for clarifications. How many eyes did it have? 2. Gotcha, he said, as if monsters were a perfectly normal thing for a police sketch artist to be drawing. In an attempt to placate me, it was pretty transparent. The biggest giveaway was when he tried to give me the finished sketch. "Don't you need this for your files or something?" I asked him. He exchanged raised eyebrows with the cop. Of course, what was I thinking? It was totally insulting. Here's the sketch artist drawing. Kind of scary looking, huh? Let's turn the page. Even my best and only friend Ricky didn't believe me. And he'd been there. He swore up and down that he hadn't seen any creature in the woods that night, even though I'd shined my flashlight right at it, which is just what he told the cops. He'd heard barking, though. We both had. So it wasn't a huge surprise when the police concluded that a pack of feral dogs had killed my grandfather. Apparently, they'd been spotted elsewhere and had taken bites out of a woman who'd been walking in Century Woods the week before. All at night, mind you, which is exactly when the creatures are the hardest to see, I said. But Ricky just shook his head and muttered something about needing a brain shrinker. You mean a head shrinker? I replied, and thanks a lot. It's great to have such supportive friends. We were sitting on my roof deck, watching the sunset over the Gulf. Ricky coiled like a spring in an unreasonably expensive Adirondack chairs my parents had brought back from a trip to Amish country. His legs folded beneath him and arms crossed tight, chain smoking cigarettes with a kind of grim determination. He always seemed vaguely uncomfortable at my house, but I could tell by the way his eyes slid off of me whenever he looked in my direction that now it wasn't my parents' wealth that was making him uneasy, but me. Whatever, I'm just being straight with you, he said. Keep talking about monsters and they're going to put you away. Then you really will be special ed. Don't call me that. He flicked away a cigarette and spat a huge glistening wad over the railing. Were you just smoking and chewing tobacco at the same time? What are you, my mom? Ricky was a connoisseur of your mom jokes, but this was apparently more than he could take. He sprang out of the chair and shoved me so hard I almost fell off the roof. I yelled at him to get out, but he was already going. It was months before I'd seen him again. So much for having friends. Eventually, my parents did take me to see a brain shrinker, a quiet, olive-skinned man named Dr. Golan. I didn't put up a fight. I knew I needed help. I thought I'd be a tough case, but Dr. Golan made surprisingly quick work of me. The calm, effectiveless way he explained things was almost hypnotizing. And within 2 sessions, he'd convinced me that the creature had been nothing more than the product of my overheated imagination. That the trauma of my grandfather's death had made me see something that wasn't really there. It was Grandpa Portman's stories that had planted the creature in my mind to begin with, Dr. Golan explained. So it only made sense that, kneeling there with his body in my arms and reeling from the worst shock of my young life, I had conjured up my grandfather's own boogeyman. There was even a name for it, acute stress reaction. I don't see anything cute about it, my mother said when she heard my shiny new diagnosis. The joke didn't bother me, though. Almost anything sounded better than crazy. Just because I no longer believed in that monsters were real didn't mean I was better, though. I still suffered from nightmares. I was twitchy and paranoid, bad enough at interacting with other people that my parents hired a tutor, so that I only had to go to school on days I felt up to it. They also finally let me quit Smart Aid. Feeling better became my new job. Pretty soon I was determined to be fired from this one too. Once the small matter of my temporary madness had been cleared up, Dr. Golan's function seemed mainly to consist of writing prescriptions. Still having nightmares? I've got something for that. Panic attack on the school bus? This should do the trick. Can't sleep? Let's up the dosage. All those pills were making me fat and stupid. And I was still miserable, getting only 3 to 4 hours to sleep a night. That's why I started lying to Dr. Golan. I pretended to be fine, when anyone who looked at me could see the bags under my eyes and the way I jumped like a nervous cat at sudden noises. One week I faked an entire dream journal, making my dreams sound bland and simple, the way a normal person should be. One dream was about going to the dentist. In another, I was flying. 2 nights in a row, I told him I dreamed I was naked at school. Then he stopped me. What about the creatures? I shrugged. No sign of them. Guess that means I'm getting better, huh? Dr. Golan tapped his pen for a moment and then wrote something down. I hope you're not just telling me what you think I want to hear. Of course not, I said, my gaze skirting the frame degrees on his wall, all attesting to his expertness in various subdisciplines of psychology, including, I'm sure, how to tell when an acutely stressed teenager is lying to you. Hey guys, I'm going to pause for a second so I can go get a drink of water. Be right back. I'm back. Thanks for letting me do that. All right, let's finish this. Okay. What about the creatures? I shrugged. No sign of them. Guess that means I'm getting better, huh? Dr. Golan tapped his pen for a moment and then wrote something down. I hope you're not just telling me what you think I want to hear. Of course not, I said. My gaze skirting the framed degrees on his wall, all attesting to his expertness in various subdisciplines of psychology, including, I'm sure, how to tell when an acutely stressed teenager is lying to you. Let's be real for a minute. He set down his pen. You're telling me you didn't have the dream even one night last week? This week. I'd always been a terrible liar. Rather than humiliating myself, checking my timer, I copped to it. Well, I muttered, maybe one. The truth was that I'd had that dream every night that week. With minor variations, it always went like this. I'm crouched in the corner of my grandfather's bedroom. Amber dusk light retreating from the windows, pointing a big plastic BB rifle at the door. An enormous glowing vending machine looms where the bed should be, filled not with candy, but rows of razor-sharp tactical knives and armor-piercing pistols. My grandfather's there in an old British Army uniform, feeding the machine dollar bills, but it takes a lot to buy a gun, and we're running out of time. Finally, a .45 spins towards the glass, but before it falls, it gets stuck. He swears in Yiddish, kicks the machine, then kneels down and reaches inside to try to grab it. But his arm gets caught. That's when they come, their long black tongues slithering up the windows, looking for a way in. I point the BB gun at them and pull the trigger, but nothing happens. Meanwhile, Grandpa Portman is shouting like a crazy person, "Find the bird! Find the loop! Jacob, don't you understand?" And then the windows shatter and the glass rains in and black tongues are all over us. And that's generally when I wake up in a puddle of sweat, my heart doing hurdles and my stomach tied in knots. Even though the dream was always the same and we'd been over it 100 times, Dr. Golan still made me describe it in every session. It's like he was cross-examining my subconscious, looking for some clue he might have missed the 99th time around. And in your dream, what's your grandfather saying? The same stuff as always, I said, about the bird and the loop in his grave. His last words. I nodded. Dr. Golan tented his fingers and pressed them to his chin, the very picture of a thoughtful brain shrinker. Any new ideas about what they might mean? I wanted to act like I didn't care about the last words, but I did. It had been eating away at me almost as much as the nightmares. I felt like I owed it to my grandfather not to dismiss the last thing he said to anyone in the world as delusional nonsense, and Dr. Golan was convinced that understanding them might help me purge my awful dreams. So I tried. Sorry guys, my computer was almost dead, so I had to really quickly get inside and plug it in so we didn't miss out on reading. Okay, here we are. Some of what Grandpa Portman had said made sense. Like the thing about wanting me to go to the island. He was worried that the monsters would come after me, and thought the island was the only place I could escape them. Like he had as a kid. After that, he'd said, I should have told you. But because there was no time to tell me whatever it was that he should have told me, I wondered if he hadn't done the next best thing and left a trail of breadcrumbs leading to someone who could tell me, someone who knew his secret. I figured that's what all the cryptic sounding stuff about the loop and the grave and the letter was. So now he's starting to think about maybe Grandpa was trying to lead him to something. For a while, I thought the Loop could be a street in Circle Village, a neighborhood that was nothing but looping cul-de-sacs, and that Emerson might be a person my grandfather had sent letters to, an old war buddy he'd kept in touch with or something. Maybe this Emerson lived in Circle Village in one of its loops by a graveyard, and one of the letters he'd kept was dated September 3rd, 1940, and that was the one I needed to read. I knew it sounded crazy, but crazier things have turned out to be true. So after hitting dead ends online, I went to Circle Village Community Center, where the old folks gather to play shuffleboard and discuss their most recent surgeries, to ask where the graveyard was and whether anyone knew a Mr. Emerson. They looked at me like I had a second head growing out of my neck, baffled that a teenage person was even speaking to them. There was no graveyard in Circle Village and no one in the neighborhood named Emerson, and no street called Loop Drive or Loop Avenue or Loop anything. It was a complete bust. Still, Dr. Golan wouldn't let me quit. He suggested I look into Ralph Waldo Emerson, a supposedly famous old poet. Emerson wrote his fair share of letters, he said. Maybe that's what your grandfather was referring to. It seemed like a shot in the dark, but just to get Golan off my back, one afternoon I had my dad drop me off to the library so I could check it out. I quickly discovered that Ralph Waldo Emerson had indeed written lots of letters that had been published. For about 3 minutes, I got really excited, like I was close to a breakthrough, and then two things became apparent. First, that Ralph Waldo Emerson had lived and died in the 1800s, and therefore could not have written any letters dated September 3rd, 1940. And second, that his writing was so dense and arcane that it couldn't possibly have held the slightest interest for my grandfather, who wasn't exactly an avid reader. I discovered Emerson's qualities the hard way, by falling asleep with my face in the book, drooling all over an essay called Self-Reliance, and having the vending machine dream for the 6th time that week. I woke up screaming and was unceremoniously ejected from the library, cursing Dr. Golan and his stupid theories all the while. Oh, I didn't realize he was sleeping in the library. That's funny. The last straw came a few days later, when my family decided it was time to sell Grandpa Portman's house. Before prospective buyers could be allowed inside, though, the place had to be cleaned out. On the advice of Dr. Golan, who thought it would be good for me to comfort the scene of my trauma, I was enlisted to help my dad and Aunt Susie sort through the detritus. For a while after we got to the house, my dad kept taking me aside to make sure I was okay. Surprisingly, I seemed to be, despite the scraps of police tape clinging to the shrubs and the torn screen on the lanai flapping in the breeze. These things, like the rented dumpster that stood on the curb, waited to be swallowed what remained of my grandfather's life. It made me sad, not scared. Once it became clear I wasn't about to suffer a mouth-frothing freakout, we got down to business. Armed with garbage bags, we proceeded grimly through the house, emptying shelves and cabinets and crawl spaces, discovering geometries of dust beneath objects unmoved for years. We built pyramids of things that could be saved or salvaged, and pyramids of things destined for the dumpster. My aunt and father were not sentimental people, and the dumpster pile was always the largest. I lobbied hard to keep certain things, like the 8-foot stack of water-damaged National Geographic magazines teetering in the corner of the garage. How many afternoons had I spent poring over them, imagining myself among the mudmen of New Guinea, or discovering a cliff-top castle in a kingdom of Bhutan. But it was always overruled. Neither was I allowed to keep my grandfather's collection of vintage bowling shirts. That's embarrassing, my dad claimed. His big band and swing 78s. Someone will pay good money for those. Or the contents of his massive, still locked weapons cabinet. You're kidding, right? I hope you're kidding. I told my dad he was being heartless. My aunt fled the scene, leaving us alone in the study where we'd been sorting through a mountain of old financial records. I'm just being practical. This is what happens when people die, Jacob. Yeah, how about when you die? Should I burn all your old manuscripts? He flushed. I shouldn't have said it. Mentioning his half-finished book projects was definitely below the belt. Instead of yelling at me, though, he was quiet. I brought you along today because I thought you were mature enough to handle it. I guess I was wrong. You are wrong. You think getting rid of all Grandpa's stuff will make me forget him, but it won't. He threw up his hands. You know what? I'm sick of fighting about it. Keep whatever you want. He tossed a sheaf of yellowed papers at my feet. Here's an itemized schedule of deductions from the year Kennedy was assassinated. Go have it framed. I kicked away the papers and walked out, slamming the door behind me, and then waited in the living room for him to come out and apologize. When I heard the shredder roar to life, I knew he wasn't going to, so I stomped across the house and locked myself in the bedroom. It smelled of stale air and shoe leather and my grandfather's slightly sour cologne. I leaned against the wall. My eyes followed a trail worn into the carpet between the door and the bed, where a rectangle of muted sun caught the edge of a box that poked out from beneath the bedspread. I went over and knelt down and pulled it out. It was an old cigar box enveloped in dust, as if he'd left it there just for me to find. Dun, dun, dun. Let's see what it is. Inside were the photos I knew so well, the invisible boy, the levitating girl, the boulder lifter, the man with the face painted on the back of his head. They were brittle and peeling, smaller than I remember too, and looking at them now as an almost adult, it struck me how blatant the fakery was. A little burning and dodging was probably all it took to make the invisible boy's head disappear. The giant rock being hoisted by that suspiciously scrawny kid could have easily been made out of plaster or foam. But these observations were too subtle for a 6-year-old, especially one who wanted to believe. Beneath these photos were 5 more that Grandpa Portman had never shown me. I wondered why, until I looked closer. 3 were so obviously manipulated that even a kid would have seen through them. 1 was a laughable double exposure of a girl trapped inside of a bottle. Another showed a levitating child suspended by something hidden in the dark doorway behind her. The 3rd was a dog with a boy's face pasted crudely onto it. As if these weren't bizarre enough, the last 2 were something made out of David Lynch's nightmares. 1 was an unhappy young contortionist doing a frightening backbend. In the other, a pair of freakish twins were dressed in the weirdest costumes I'd ever seen. Even my grandfather, who'd filled my head with stories of tentacle-tongued monsters, had realized images like these would give any kid bad dreams. So he found more photos in Grandpa Portman's cigar box. So here are the photos. Here's one, and it's kind of hard to see, but it's a girl inside of a bottle. Here's a levitating child. This one is a dog with a human face. This one's the contortionist girl. And then these are the twins that are dressed alike. Kind of creepy looking. We're about to finish for the day. Right at this break, we're going to finish. Kneeling there on my grandfather's dusty floor with those photos in my hand, I remembered how betrayed I'd felt the day I realized his stories weren't true. Now the truth seemed obvious. His last words had just been another sleight of hand. And his last act was to infect me with nightmares and paranoid delusions that would take years of therapy and metabolism-wrecking medications to rout out. I closed the box and brought it into the living room, where my dad and Aunt Susie were emptying a drawer full of coupons, clipped but never used, into a 10-gallon trash bag. I offered up the box. They didn't ask what was inside. That's sad. So he found his grandfather's cigar box, which is where he had all the photos of what he showed Jacob when he was younger. And then underneath the ones that he showed Jacob were more, which are the pictures that we saw today. And Jacob is looking at these pictures, realizing these are fake. These are obviously fake. Here are ways that they went about making these photos. And so he's getting really disappointed because he used to believe them, and he's getting really sad that that's what his grandfather on his deathbed wanted to do to him, is tell him more scary stories and make him have nightmares. So he's kind of getting a little angry right now at his grandfather. And it is a little sad because I think he had a really good relationship with his grandpa, and he feels like he's the only one in the family who really loved him. And then now he's kind of feeling like he was tricked by him. So tomorrow we'll start at that break, and we will finish chapter 2. Like I said, chapter 2 is pretty long. So tomorrow we will start at that break and we'll finish chapter 2. All right, so go on with your day. Thanks for reading again with me. Bye, guys.